I should have been studying, but instead I was browsing a heap of websites to check for the various Black Friday sales. If there was a time to spend a heap of money on things I didn't need, it was this weekend. On top of that, I was keeping an eye out on potential items for Christmas. My guilt of all the overworked retail staff and delivery drivers outweighed my avarice for cheap goods. I was fully relaxed. Usually, my family were all doing their separate things and distracting me from whatever I did for fun on the family computer. But this time, it was all mine, and I was happily alone. Around me were various oven-cooked quick meals and a heap of snacks usually reserved for the family's movie nights. I was in charge of watching the house while my parents were away, so I took raiding the kitchen as payment for my amazing service. My job was simple. Make it look like the house was occupied while the family were gone. There had been a string of suspicious behaviors reported around my neighborhood, so my parents wanted to be extra careful. Because I was doing the unhealthy habit of sitting in the dark, staring at a brightly lit screen, it was very noticeable when another light entered the room. I turned to see the curtains to the front window glowing. This meant one thing. The motion detector out front had picked up movement. I turned back, knowing my neighborhood had a number of dog owners, including the neighbor next door, Gary, who usually cut across our yard rather than weave around his flower arrangements. An annoying habit, but one we got used to. I turned back and returned to scrolling through the many sales pages of Amazon when the glow clicked off. However, not long after, it came back to life. This made me pay more attention, trying to read into the details. When a dog walker strolled past, it usually only set off the detector once. If it went off a second time, this meant one thing in my head. The dog was going to poop on the yard. I hated this, as this usually ended up as my job to sort out, as the rest of the family were squeamish at the thought. An excuse I could never prove was false. I took this as my chance to catch whoever did this in the act, so I briskly made my way to the window, ready to peek at the culprit. As I pulled the curtain aside, I was taken aback at how different the scene in my front yard looked compared to how I'd imagined it. There was no dog in the yard, but there was still something which seemed to be setting off the sensor. It was a person. A tall, adult figure standing ominously in the middle of the yard, barely illuminated and teetering on the edge of the motion light sensor. I stared for a bit, wondering what was going on. I wanted to call out and see if they needed help, but I was too irrationally unnerved to get their attention. I settled on just slowly dropping the curtain and getting back to my computer, hoping they thought the place was vacant. As I stood there behind the closed curtain, the light soon dimmed out, and I took this as my cue to leave. However, as I turned, the light soon burst to life, once more lighting up the window. This time though, I jumped back and let out an audible yelp as I did so. My heart raced and my eyes widened as adrenaline shot through me. Something was different this time. Rather than the light simply lighting up the whole window in a dulled glow through the entire curtain, there was a dark spot. In the middle of the curtain was the silhouette of a person, very close to the glass, looking like they were trying to stare in. And there was no way they weren't aware I was in there. In a flight or fight response, I burst to the front door to check if it was locked, and to my relief, it was. I added the latch to be extra careful and used this safety to be more cautious. My next immediate reaction was to call the police. There was no way I wanted to handle this situation by myself, so I patted down my pockets, to which I remembered there were none. Thanks to the pajama bottoms I stole from my girlfriend, I had no pockets, which usually meant I left my unattended phone on the computer table. I carefully meandered back to the living room PC, but I barely got partway across the room when I stopped, dead in my tracks. The light from my brightly lit PC monitor was casting a shadow I knew it shouldn't. It was the long shadow of a person standing in the living room. The fear set in that the figure had already gotten inside. Out of reflex, I flicked my head around back to the front window, and confusion set in. The silhouette from before was still there, standing eerily still in front of the illuminated window's curtain. I jumped again at the sight of this, since I wasn't expecting it that time around, and sadly, my reaction made a sound. I heard another sound in response, and turned to see the figure in the living room react, and started heading in my direction. I gave up any semblance of stealth and ran to the front door, screaming at the person in the house to stop. Whether these two figures were working together or not wasn't my concern in that moment. All I thought was that I felt trapped in my house, and in my head, I had a better chance in the open outside world than confined in a small house. While unlocking the door, the person in the house started screaming back. He screamed at me to stand still and to stop. It was naive of him to think I would listen. This only made me move faster, knowing the only way to survive would be to do the opposite of what he wanted. I managed to fumble the front door open and ran into the darkness outside, the motion light seeming to have clicked off while I was messing with the front door lock. I took a chance and ran to the tall figure outside, now standing back in the middle of the grass, once a source of fear, now a beacon of hope. If there was a suspicious person entering my house, then this person was someone who might have been trying to warn me. I got right up to him and turned back to the front door, now feeling a bit more secure, knowing I was with someone. The abnormally slow motion light finally reacted to my movements and flashed on, hitting me in the eyes. When my eyes adjusted, I realized who I was squinting at. Standing in the front door was my neighbor, Gary, whom my parents gave a back door key to in case of emergency. He screamed at me over and over a late warning to stay away from the figure outside my house. My heart sank deep into the pit of my stomach, bile rising in my throat. Not just from the panic of realization setting in, but the rotting smell emanating from the figure beside me. I dared not look up at its face, but seeing the twisted, rotting skin on its hand by its side was enough to paint the picture that I'd made a horrible mistake. I took one last glance at Gary to see how he was going to help me. He just mouthed he's sorry and closed the front door. After I heard the front latch click, I picked up on a slight movement, the sounds of a head turning and looking down in my direction. I just carried on, staring forward in denial, my view of the front door blurring with teary eyes.